Make every night a wonderful journey, no matter where you are. Good night, sweet dreams. The first story, The Ragged Man. I do not know truly if what I recount to you now is fact or fallacy, but I know with every fibre of my being that this event did indeed happen to me 20 years ago, when I was but a boy. I was not a quiet child, and was prone to excited fits of activity as well as a trend for the obnoxious. However, this trait was well loved by my childhood playmates, and I was always the center of attention, which suited me quite nicely. I lived in a modest two-story house in the suburbs with my cheerless, rotund mother and my ever-absent father, whom I knew only through the occasional blow and birthday present. Thus, I spent most of my time exploring the urban ruins near our suburb with my fellows. The buildings were ruined shells of their former glory, crumbling and covered in vandal art, yet to us these were our homes. More familiar to us than our own dwellings, every day was spent in those decaying edifices of concrete, steel, and glass, playing amidst the rubble like the children we were. Heedless of the danger they presented, many games did we play in those old tombs, from lively rounds of tag to our favorite, hide and seek. What could be more fun than seeking your fellows in the corpse of times past? To our minds, there was no greater pleasure. The day I recount to you was exceptionally sunny, with not a cloud in the sky, allowing the golden rays of the summer sun to caress our flesh with yellow tendrils of loving warmth. It was July, and the four of us were out in the ruins as we always were, playing our games of childhood freedom today. I was one of the hunted, to be sought out by the freckled girl with red hair, whom I had for some time hidden my attraction. Sadly, the passage of time has dulled my memory, and her name's nothing more than a dream I cannot recall in full. In my cunning, I had hidden myself away in a rusted locker, whose interior was as black as sin, and whose door hung crookedly at an angle. Slipping myself inside, I stealthily closed the rusted door, peering out carefully from the slats in watch for my playmates. It was another half-hour before I was found by the red-haired girl, who laughed at my messy hair and dirt street face. I remember taking offense at the comment, for I liked her, and did not want her to find any fault, no matter how small, within me. Yet I smiled and laughed with her, which relieved my hurt and allowed me to look back at her and marvel at her beauty. As I looked, I could see my friend Tony running along towards us, his bespectacled face pale and wet with fearful tears. He told us that he had seen a dead man dressed in fine clothes, complete with a little round hollow. Said the man had no eyes, and that he could hear the buzzing of insects when he was about, that he carried a long crooked stick he used to tap the walls. Tony spat out that he had seen the Ragged Man. The Ragged Man, the horrid apparition that was said to haunt the old schoolhouse, was said to be the phantom of a dead man who took great delight in luring school children from the playground at recess and murdering them cruelly in the woods near the Soul by beating the souls of the young from their bodies with a twisted stave. He had been apprehended by town officials over 50 years ago and executed for his crimes. The school was soon after shut down, for too great was the black stain the Ragged Man left behind in his murderous wake. Sometimes, if you were unlucky, you could hear the Ragged Man tapping his death's stick on the walls of the schoolhouse, looking for more of the little ones to slay, or so the children said. We sought to calm our friend, telling him he had seen nothing more than an ill vagrant, but Tony insisted that the man was dead, and that the man had looked at him without eyes, and had tapped his stick on the floor in front of him and moved towards our friend. We wanted to dismiss such claims, but Tony's genuine fright could not be so easily dismissed, for he was the brave one of our troop, the first to jump from roof to roof or to enter a dark cave. If something had shaken him so badly, then it must be a cause for concern. We asked him where he had seen the ghoul, and he told us he had seen the monster in the ruined schoolhouse, across the crumbling street of asphalt whilst looking for our playmate Noah, whom Tony had seen enter the building, the schoolhouse, that accursed building that even we avoided as it sat there for untold years, caught in a cycle of decay that had rendered it into little more than a large boarded-up shed. We held that building in great fear because of the legends surrounding it, and never went near it after dark yet. We had no choice but to enter if we wished to save our friend, so steeling ourselves, we dared near one of the windows, grunting together and moistening our backs with perspiration. We tore the boards from the window and ventured to crawl inside. The interior was old and filthy, and I espied a rat rampell mel across the floor until it disappeared into the next room with a squeak. It was apparent that the place had seen not a living soul for many a year, since the school had been abandoned. As such, the air was stale and sour, filled with the reek of fungus and vermin droppings. Utter silence reigned as we entered the decrepit building, each of us afraid to utter a sound for fear of the ragged man. It would be prudent to note that not one of us save Tony actually believed that the ragged man was on the prowl, or rather, we let none of that belief show on our faces. To openly speak the dark thoughts squatting morbidly on our brains was to risk making them reality, and so we remained silent on the matter, mentally reaffirming our own fabricated vagrant story. With that point firmly in your head, I will commence with the continuation of my tale. Our shod feet made clearly defined indents in the plain of dust that covered the worm-beaten floorboards, which creaked and moaned as if greatly pained by our footfalls. We began our search where we had entered, in a side hallway that spread to either side of our vision. It would be untrue to say we were without fear. Indeed, the niggling notion that the phantasm of our night terror was made manifest may have been walking the very same halls, as we did nothing to quell our unease. The filthy place was illuminated only by the fading sunlight that streamed from the window we had unbarred. Shadows stretched hungrily towards us, a fact I found odd. Should not the shadows reach outwards instead of in? I mentioned this to both my armor and Tony, who tried to be nonchalant, but failed to hide their unease at my statement. It was plain that both of them would rather be anywhere else than the rotting house of learning, and I must confess I felt the same. But Noah was still within, and we could not leave him behind. So onwards we trudged into the dark. Our fear gradually mutated into creeping dread as our hour of search turned up not a sign of Noah. Tony began to whisper that the ragged man had indeed led Noah's spirit on a speedy exodus from his fleshy shell at the end of a twisted cane. I demanded that he be silent and not trouble us with such nonsense. Yet, even I was beginning to worry by now. We should have discovered our wayward playmate and companion and returned home for supper. Onwards we continued our search into the dilapidated remains of the main office, where old papers had been left by those who did not care enough to sweep them aside into a garbage bin. My Amu was the one who pointed out the odd odor in the room, something like the musty aroma of dust that permeated the other rooms of the building. It was foul with rotten corruption and ripe with decay, yet howling with the scent of acrid copper. The smell I will never forget. Be this recount reality or some dark dream in an effort to locate the source of the reek. Mine eyes fell to the great oaken desk laden with curling paper. Not only was paper that which adorned the desk, but a grisly varnish of dark crimson as well, flecked madly over the wood like a Pollock painting. Fearing for the very worst, I began to feel tears welling up inside me in an ocean but I felt that I must set an example in the face of such adversity, and as such I gulped back the sea and peered over the desk, dread deep in my breast. The sight that greeted me confirmed my worst fears, my darkest nightmares made manifest by what mine eyes beheld. Now a lake rumpled like a soft puppet on the ashen floor. So smashed and beaten was he that at first my mind was baffled by the sheer number of new joints in his spindly limbs. His bones protruded at angles inhuman and terrible, and the shock of such a sight unleashed the ocean within me, and I cried mightily for many a moment. My amour and Tony did not hesitate in their terror-fueled tears either, and we wept as we leapt back from the body of our once friend and companion and ran as fast as our young legs were able. We reached as far as the cafeteria ravaged by time and vandals when we stopped. Out of breath and will to continue, we slumped down into the dust, our chests heaving in woe at what we had just seen. We wept and proclaimed loudly in our young voices the horror of the experience, wondering with fright if it had been indeed the ragged man that had so directly slain our playmate. It was Tony who mentioned the prospect of telling Noah's mother of his slaughter, a kindly woman late in years to whom Noah was the only thing cruel fate had left her after it had stolen her husband and her youth. She had been good to us, and the knowledge that her grief and horror would far outstrip our own made the task that much more difficult. We fell silent for a moment after that, compiling our thoughts and using every ounce of our willpower to remain in control of ourselves. That was when we heard a sound that chilled the very blood in our veins. Clack, clack, clack. The rhythmic tapping of wood on stone echoed throughout the schoolhouse, announcing the presence of the lurking fear we had secretly been ever dreading since our arrival. The ragged man. Clack, clack. What else could the demon sound herald? For we had seen the corpse of Noah, and secretly all knew who the culprit was, the butcher of children with his bloody cane held high. Clack, clack, clack. Closer now. The sound drew nearer, and paralyzed with fear, we could do nothing as the hideous spectre rounded the corner. I surmised that the tale spinners were correct to call this thing, this aberration, the ragged man. Although man was clearly in error. The creature was nothing but inhuman, a spindly figure of over 8 feet composed of grey, alien flesh, the skin drawn tight across its cadaverous frame. Long, thin arms nearly scraped the floor, as freakishly flexible fingers coiled like serpents around the bloody rod clenched in its pallid hand. The weapon was black as night, and no extraordinary features save for the sleek sheen of blood and hair that coated its surface. Ever did the cane tap the floor with that damning rhythm. The monster had no lips. Indeed, it appeared that the skin around its mouth had been peeled away to reveal stark white teeth that seemed to shine brightly in the gloom. Its eyes, oh God! Its eyes, but it had none. Only black pits sunken deep into its hairless skull, holes that showed not the absence of light, but the presence of darkness itself. It came towards us, cane tapping and sockets fixed upon us with murderous intent, its exposed teeth causing the creature to grin maniacally. We could not even cry out as it approached us, so afraid were we. Before we could breath, we saw the monster towering over us, its sexless body skeletal and pale. What broke the spell over my unwanted was the sound of the black cane splitting Tony's skull open like a rye, the heavy cudgel turning his skull to glass shards and his brain into jelly with a single overhead swing. Tony toppled over, his useless cranium spilling its contents onto the great aisles in a horrifying fashion, the monstrosity of the act giving us the push we needed to attempt our escape. We ran through the only other exit in the cafeteria, waiting and sobbing as we did so, the ragged man pursuing slowly, umbrily, his limbs distending and snapping weirdly as it dragged its bloody cane behind it through the dust. I turned my head once to look back, and my eyes met the black pits above the leering face, showing me a darkness deeper and more tenebrous than I could ever comprehend. I feel we were allowed to escape that dark and horrible place of murder and monsters only because the ragged man wished us to. I know not why the horror would do such a thing, take the lives of two of our playmates yet spare us. I spoke little to my amour after the event, both of us too afraid to walk down the path of remembrance we feared would lead to madness. When I am alone, and the lights have all been extinguished, I can sometimes see the awful outline of the ragged man in the shadows, those black pits darker than the night surrounding them. Below them, the leering smile grins at me from the darkness, the white teeth glittering in the dark. Then he taps his cane on the wall, as if to remind me that I live at his leisure. I still do not know why he has chosen me, but I fear whatever fell purpose I might serve if it were but insanity that plagued me, and not some living horror. I would rejoice, but the ragged man knows these thoughts, and by wounding me with his cane while I sleep, proves to me the lies I tell to protect myself from the dire truth. The second story, try to forget. Have you ever tried to remember something, and no matter how hard you try, it's just no use? If I were you, I would stop trying. There is a reason for this. It is for your own safety. About a decade ago, there was an experiment. It started out small. A few scientist friends working together to try to unravel the mysteries of the human brain. One thing that struck them was memory. Why was it that some things were easier to remember? Why are some memories locked away so tight that you can't remember, no matter how hard you try? Well, after months of painstaking research, they found some answers. Their studies, fortunately, never made it to the public. They discovered a way to completely remove memories from someone's mind. The idea was that if you removed all the excess memories, you could get to the memory you wanted to remember. Since no other memories were interfering, the removed memories were stored as data, to be reinstated into your mind afterwards. After months of preparation, finding a willing volunteer, and perfecting the operations, an experiment was ready to be performed. The volunteer was a man, but I could gain no other information. A date was set, an event which the man remembered occurring, but could not bring to surface. Strapping him into the complex machinery, they removed all of his memories except for that date. Everything was fine up to that point. He came back silent at first. Looking around confused, he seemed normal enough, if a little lost. After about 15 minutes, he began screaming. He tossed over the machine beside him, startling the scientists. He began screaming, "I remember them. I remember." He fell to his knees, clawing at his face, until he began to bleed, still shouting incomprehensibly. Eventually the scientists got him and sedated him. They put him back and attempted to understand what had happened. Perhaps they had damaged his brain, They looked at his brainwave sequence to determine whether this was true. What they saw next really took them by surprise. Nothing. His brainwaves were at absolutely no activity whatsoever. Yet, the man was still breathing heavily and murmuring in his sleep. They checked his heart rate, nothing. They went over with a stethoscope. No beat, none. They checked the machinery, but could not find a single flaw. A little freaked out, they decided to retire for the day and come back tomorrow. They left the cameras on, recording every movement in the laboratory. In a journal found in the abandoned laboratory days later, one of the scientists had written that night, "I cannot sleep. I don't know why exactly, but I have a feeling of immense disturbance. Perhaps it was today's events. Something about the way that man screamed was more than insanity, more than delirium brought on by drugs or anything. It was real, genuine fear of the deepest and most instinctive kind. Something is wrong. Something is deeply wrong with what has happened. But what it is, I believe, is one of those things most likely left unconceived." The next day, the scientists returned to see how the man was doing. He was gone, he vanished. Nowhere to be seen. The scientists checked the cameras, but after footage of the man sleeping for about 3 hours, it went static. Rewinding and slowing it down, they could see a faint stir in the man. A shadow seemed to flicker across the wall right before the static ensued. They decided to open the chamber and investigate the room. Upon entry, many of the doctors fainted immediately. A few threw up and collapsed on the ground in a fever. The others simply stood, unable to comprehend what was in front of them. Loads of blood covered nearly every surface in the entire room and almost a foot deep from the ground. It was far more blood than can be contained in one or even a dozen human bodies. The sickening smell of decaying flesh floated out of the room, making the scientists sick. Here and there floated chunks of meat, organs, an eyeball. The only part of the room left blank was a small patch of the far wall, where the blood left a blank spot, forming the words, "Do not remember, try to forget." Immediately the project was shut down. The blood and gore was drained out through drains in the floor. The scientists sold the area and left. They changed names or left the country, doing anything to never be found again. Many were found to have committed suicide weeks after the event. About a week after they had left and abandoned the facility, a body was found during construction of a new building in the area. The cement in the parking lot was pulled up. The body was found, emaciated and unrecognizable. Beneath, strangely enough, the head was severed from the body. It was found buried near a tree not far off, completely unharmed. To this day, no one knows what occurred, and many refuse to believe anything occurred at all. All that is known is that for whatever reason, those thoughts that cannot be remembered are blocked out in order to protect us. From what and why, I believe, is better left unknown. The third story, missing children. I always had strange and vivid dreams as a child, and even now, though I'm into my 20s, one dream always comes to mind when I'm browsing in antique stores. Every time I spot it all, at least one of those porcelain ones with the glass eyes. You know the type of eyes that seem to gaze into your soul. Well, some of them are so detailed and realistic, they give me the creeps. But as I was saying, when I was a child, I had such a messed up dream, and that may be why I still don't enjoy looking at those porcelain dolls. And also, why I don't enjoy them looking back at me. Once, long ago, there were these deep, dark woods that many children were terrified of. There was an old woman living in a cottage out there. and many people claimed she was a witch. She seemed nice enough, but she always had this look in her eye when she saw children, as if she were eyeing them as prey now. Many women would visit this old lady in hopes of learning their future and whatnot, and learning home remedies for illnesses, and gaining knowledge of some old wives' tales. Sometimes the woman would even sell herbal tinctures and potions and things of the like. Every now and then, a mother would send her child out to purchase one of these items from the elderly woman, but sometimes the child would not return. This is where I saw things getting strange. The old woman would invite the child to sit down and have some food and a drink. The child would sit down at the table and take a bite of the cookies set before them, only for their mouth to grow dry. They had lost the ability to speak or make any noise at all. Thirsty from that horribly dry feeling in their throat, they would take a drink, only to realize soon that it was growing harder and harder to move. They were becoming paralyzed. While the child was paralyzed and mute, the witch would cut off their arms, legs, and head, baking the torso to have her meal, which was likely the source of her living for so long. Later, she would shrink and petrify these parts and fit them onto plush bodies, fashioning dolls out of them. Such beautiful dolls always fetched a high price at the marketplace. Sometimes the mothers of the lost children would buy the dolls with such a likeness to their missing child as a keepsake, and knowingly keeping their child's remains. After that dream, I can never comfortably look at a porcelain, and all the eyes of the dolls give such sorrowful and accusing looks, though lifeless. Every time I see one, I think of how many children go missing every day, and though my dream was probably no more accurate than a silly fairy tale, it still unnerves me. Written by Shinigami Eyes.